Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Kerry Thomas. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise, and it's a great pleasure to have your company again this evening for thinking about COVID and corruption and procurement and that whole host of things. If you were at the opening day of the Tortoise COVID inquiry last Friday, you'll know that we set ourselves a fairly simple question to answer, because on health and on the economy, the UK is probably going to come out of this pandemic in worse shape than any other country. So why is that? I think tonight we've got the chance to try to understand whether culture and process have played a part in where we've ended up. Has a too close relationship between politicians and people in business, the chumocracy, to use the shorthand, has that been a part of the explanation? Or has there actually been out and out corruption as the normal rules of procurement been ripped up as government has tried to get contracts for things like protective equipment out of the door in a hurry? That's I think the heart of what we're going to be talking about tonight. But actually, I also want to explore a different aspect of political culture, because I think we'd all recognise that there's a tendency these days to paint political opponents as malign and corrupt when sometimes they're just a bit useless. So a lot of bad decisions have been taken during this pandemic, but then an awful lot of decisions have been taken. So to go back to the question, is COVID cover for corruption, or is there an extent to which it's just revealing things that we're not very good at? So we've got a brilliant set of experts to help us think our way through some of those issues tonight. I'll come to them soon, but let me just introduce them up top. So we've got Jacob Rees, who's chief exec of a big European health provider called Falk, which does health services and health equipment. So Jacob would have been in the room, for a number of these important decisions over the last several months. We've got Daniel Bruce, who's the chief exec of Transparency International, an organisation that just focuses on corruption. We've got Sophie Hill, who set up an interactive website, a map of government contacts and contracts called My Little Crony, which I think gives you an indication of where Sophie's coming from. And we've got Tom Burgess, who is the journalist at the FT and author of it says kleptomania here, Tom, but that's not right, is it? It's I'll remember the proper title in a second. Sorry, I've got the wrong, but I'll come to you in a second. Jacob from Falk, can I bring you in straight away at the top here? Because are you there? Let me just see if I can find you.
Yeah, I'm here.
Terrific. Well, perhaps just in a minute, just tell us what Falk does. That would help us just understand.
You're right. We do healthcare services to the end user, and then we have the biggest part of the company is emergency services. So that's fire brigade at industrial production plants and so forth. And then we run ambulances in a number of countries around the world. So in particular, the ambulance business was where we were hit during the COVID for in a number of ways.
Okay, so you are procured by governments, by health ministries, by health providers to provide a range of different things. Do you provide equipment or just services?
We typically take the full contract, so that could be a part of San Francisco, Alameda County. So we basically run all ambulances for that about 1.5 million people that live in Alameda. So that's a typical. And here you mentioned word culture. I mean, UK is the outlier around the world. UK would never outsource an ambulance service, but you'd outsource your prisons to private companies. I think many parts of the world it's the other way around, or maybe both. So we typically take a contract for a certain geography. It is typically sort of, it could be a 50 million pound contract annually. So fairly large contracts that run for 5 years. Okay,
so can you just take us back? Because obviously when we're thinking about the way that contracting has been done through a pandemic, which is really the sort of part of what we're talking about this evening, what take us back to the months when things were at their peak, maybe March through to June, that kind of period.
Yeah.
Describe to me what was the atmosphere like at that time in your business?
Yeah, it was. You could say it was hectic is one word, and it was a period of time where we tried to figure out what is going to be the biggest obstacle to maintaining the critical infrastructure, health infrastructure. Would it be that we would run short of staff because they got sick? Would it be that we ran out of equipment, or would we be pressured on the financials? So we needed to refinance, secure liquidity, and we needed to set up some very tight monitoring and have plans, both the plan A, B, and C in terms of how we could pull in more resources should we be under pressure in terms of delivering the ambulance services. But then there was also an element of securing that we could protect our employees with standard equipment that is normally not an issue: masks, gowns, gloves, all these things. And that market sort of within literally days started heating up, sort of civilized in the beginning, but then it just got worse and worse. So every time we'd close the contract, we might realize that some government had basically just taken over the shipment and said that we wouldn't receive it. As I said, decisions had to be made a little within hours, and some of the prices on simple issues like masks and so on went to, astronomical numbers, and we were sort of torn between: do we protect our employees, but can it really be true we need to pay millions for something that normally would only cost a couple of maybe 20,000-30,000 pounds to procure? So it was very hectic. And if I am to add to that, then as you started hearing, various companies that would promise you this, that, and the other, your normal supply chains dried up, and that meant that you had to figure out how to deal with this. But the biggest challenge, or not the biggest, but one of the big challenges was at the same time as all the airplanes stopped flying with tourists and passengers, the world also lost a lot of the capacity to move goods very fast. So essentially, it wasn't a problem to buy something, but you just couldn't get it to where you were. And typically, it would be out of Asia and to Europe. So very uncertain. And it pretty much in the period you talk about, from the initial sort of chaos, I think it started to ease up in June because, around that, we realized that something like face masks, gowns, all these protective measures could be produced so cheaply. And eventually we also started receiving shipments, but typically through connections and people who had businesses in Asia. So the normal routes were just not feasible. And I'll end there. So that was part of the picture.
And did you see the businesses or the governments that procure your services, did you see them behaving differently around Europe, around the world? Were the normal procurement rules being ripped up everywhere, or was this a peculiarly British thing?
No, I think we had examples where essentially it was the largest Danish companies that had a big presence in China or Singapore, or whatever, particularly we needed out of either Korea or China. Those companies could leverage their connections. They knew either somebody in customs, or they could charter a flight and get a permission to land and extract the goods. But it was a situation where I think there was nothing that was even close to normal. And some of the biggest shipments of personal protection equipment in Denmark actually came in via one of the big fashion and clothing retail companies that's Danish and operates around China. They basically sort of donated the part of their transportation, you could say, capacity and helped out. So no, it was connections, and nothing was normal at that point in time.
Yeah. So you're painting a picture of a situation in which if there were bad actors out there, then bad things could certainly have happened. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. But you could say bad actors would typically in my book, and this is about what I know about this, so I'm also very cautious extending way beyond. But bad actors could certainly land deals, but they could not. You could say you needed to be a serious operator if you wanted to move something. So you saw examples of substandard masks being sold and so on. But typically you could sort of quickly smell whether this was a serious company or whether this was just somebody claiming to have a connection. But there were a lot of those. But I think we didn't buy anything that was not quality. Our procurement professionals worked around the clock, and we just barely got what we needed. But I would say, had you not had a little bit of military background, a little bit of ice in the stomach, and also sometimes the ability within minutes to say yes to a big invoice, but also the guts to say, forget about it. This is not gonna, we're not gonna pay you. And then things, as I said, eventually started normalizing. But I could imagine that, and we know that the public sector in Denmark procured more aggressively. And I think, we just, even though FAC is a sizable company, we don't have unlimited funds, and nobody's going to pick up the bill afterwards if we make a mistake. So we were probably a little more cautious than a few others were. Yeah.
Okay. Jakob, that's a really helpful start. Thank you. I think it paints a really interesting and useful picture of what the atmosphere and what behaviours were like at the time. Sophie Hill from My Little Crony, can I just bring you in? Because I'm just interested in what was it that you started this website since the pandemic? What was it that first caught your attention in this whole sort of melee of things that we've seen in this country?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a PhD candidate in government at Harvard, but in this, I'm not really an expert. I think I'm just an average citizen, and I was really trying to make sense of all the news stories I was reading about this procurement scandal. And there are all these names, right, that keep popping up in different contexts. And I felt that I just couldn't piece them all together. I couldn't see that bigger picture, right? We're in these unprecedented times and trying to make sense of a £250 million contract going to a firm with no experience in the healthcare sector. Like, how do we interpret that? And so I started building this map, at the start for myself, just to try and have a kind of cheat sheet, if you like, of the key players. And I think as I kept building it, and I've been adding, even in recent days, more and more connections, I think what you start to see is just an alarming number of links very directly between the Conservative Party and companies that are winning contracts. And I think, although I called it My Little Crony, I think people can make their own judgments. And that's why I set up the map to be interactive. And, each link there has a source, and you can follow and read the underlying reporting by outlets like Byline Times and Open Democracy, who have done an amazing job on this story. So I made this really to try and help people navigate that web of stories and really go back and read the underlying journalism.
Okay, and you said you were struggling to find an explanation, but does what Jakob just said, does that help you understand that there might be several different explanations for this?
Absolutely. And I think, there are many cases of companies winning contracts where it looks like they maybe shouldn't have been, and they didn't have any political connections, right? There are stories that look much more like sort of incompetence and a very rushed process. And then there are other cases where there are political connections involved. You think of Ayanda Capital, which has received a lot of media attention because of the role of Andrew Mills, who's an advisor to the Board of Trade, and his role facilitating that deal. Those are examples that really raise a lot of questions. And I think we could frame this right as, well, is this about incompetence or corruption, or just a government doing the best it can in really difficult circumstances? But to me, we're not mind readers, right? We're never going to have an answer to that question. And what matters really are the outcomes. So did the taxpayers get value for money? And number two, did the government behave in a way that it was seen to be fair and transparent, regardless of its intentions at the time? And I think those are the two questions that I think we still have a lot of concerns over.
Okay, Luke, my colleague Luke Bedimer, who's on the chat, but also I think put together the slides that some of you would have seen before we got into the discussion this evening. Luke, if you're there, because I think there's an awful lot of smoke, and it's hard to spot the fire. Can you just run us through the slides and just tell us what you found when you were looking into this whole area?
Absolutely, yeah. So we started with one of the most credible sources internationally for establishing, like you said, Kerry, at the start, kind of what was going on beforehand, what was the baseline in terms of public sector behavior around transparency and indeed corruption. So we looked at the Corruption Perceptions Index, which is, of course, first and foremost a reflection of survey data from experts and business people about the perceived level of transparency and visibility to public decision making, public spending. It's qualitative in a way, but on this measure, the UK does fairly well, suggesting that the UK's civil access to information is good, and particularly transparency on public spending is also high. So looking into that public spending, upon which we have a decent level of transparency, we've seen a massive acceleration around the pandemic in the amount of money being tendered to private companies, mostly on the basis of providing PPE, supporting the test and trace system, hospitals, medicine, other supplies. And it was important, I think, for us to call attention to the fact that under some emergency powers, lots of these contracts, 71 suppliers, relevant to 71 suppliers, and totaling £1.5 billion, were basically accelerated past the normal due diligence, financial and company-based, that would be imposed on contracts awarded by the government. So this is the kind of numeric uptick. We just saw the value uptick. But what this also calls attention to is the kind of the change from the baseline. So the pandemic has massively accelerated the amount of contracts being awarded against or within offices that aren't used to dealing with this amount of administration, this amount of paperwork. So I think this is an important one to reflect how dramatic a change the pandemic has prompted. So in this case, we've got an example of two contracts, one awarded to Serco and one to Randox, both very large established contractors with relatively long histories of provision in exactly these areas of healthcare supply and healthcare services. And then the final slide shows, shows some of the other contracts awarded to small companies. And I think, to echo what Sophie has just said, people can and should draw their own conclusions about the nature of these contracts and of course, whether value's been delivered for the public through them being executed. So, yeah.
Luke, that's great, thank you. And actually, it's a good cue for me to bring in Daniel Bruce from Transparency International. Daniel, can I just, Luke's touched on it there, but if you had to give a sort of score out of 10 for the UK pre-pandemic on that sort of global comparison table of corruption and perceptions of corruption, what would you score the UK?
Well, you've shown our headline statistic. We're number 12 in the Global Corruption Perceptions Index, which looks at what, it's an index of indices, which looks at what a range of key stakeholders consider to be the risk of corruption in a country's public sector. And yes, we sit very high at the top of the table relative to most other countries around the world. But I want to share with you another statistic from 2016, which I think speaks to some of the broader concerns that people in this country have about related issues pre-pandemic. And this is research from 2016, which showed that 76% of people in the UK think that wealthy individuals use their influence on government to further their own interests. Now, that was pre-pandemic, The other measure that we have is, which came out recently, is the UK's Exporting Corruption Report. And again, we're considered to be one of the top countries when it comes to enforcement of foreign bribery laws around the world. There is a parallel challenge, which I know Tom will pick me up on if I don't mention it, which is that the City of London and the UK has a big problem with the amount of dirty money which flows through this country. Now, that's another issue, but it's not always captured in the Corruption Perceptions Index, which looks at, if you like, the national integrity system as opposed to the global picture. But I think that issue of kind of trust of the integrity of the process to ensure that public money is always being spent in the public interest was already quite low coming into this crisis. Now, we, along with many others here tonight, have been closely monitoring the sort of daily drip feed of questions about public procurement in the crisis. This is preliminary finding, and we will have more formal publication of research, hopefully in the coming weeks on this. But a headline that I can share with you is that of the amount of money that's been talked about and that which was examined by the National Audit Office last week, we have found 52 public contracts worth around £2 billion of taxpayers' money, where there are some serious red flags over the way in which the contracts were awarded. And there are sort of 4 or 5 different measures that we've been looking at there. So what we have today is a picture which is far from complete. We just don't know why those red flags are there. We just don't know why this pattern of decision-making has existed around public procurement in the crisis so far.
And Danny, those 52 contracts, the £2 billion of public money that you think you should be concerned, or we should all be concerned about, what are the red flags you've seen there that have raised those concerns?
So examples would be, again, some of the issues that the NAO picked up on last week, backdating of contracts, so work happening many months before the formal agreement in place. Evidence that conflicts of interest are being managed poorly. And I think, again, that speaks to some of our concerns this evening, and that could be around the specifics of individual cases, or it could just be a reflection of where the system was at coming into the crisis, but which is then brought into sharp relief by the overall process. But I have to say, one thing I just have to get out there early, if I may, is that I think the thing which really alarmed us, which was new coming out of the NAO report last week, was the existence of this high priority lane for contracting. Now, we accept that all of the NAO has found that all of the usual checks and balances around procurement have been applied to contracts that went through that high priority lane. But this was set up so that MPs, politicians of all stripes, ministers, officials could make faster referrals of companies that they knew that they felt would be appropriate to get a direct award for some form of COVID-related contract. And I think we have to take a step back from that and look at all of the other architecture that we normally have around the around the management of conflict of interest and say, well, hang on a minute, normally when we do this, we put in place extra protections to ensure that there isn't a conflict of interest, so that civil servants and ministers and others can't do this. And so why on earth, what is the actual justification for putting in place a system that does the complete opposite of that? And we still don't have satisfactory answers to some of those questions yet.
Yeah, well, I suspect the answer would be that if you're dealing with a torrent of people who are coming forward and saying we can help, that you need some way to triage that, don't you? And how do you do that in the moment unless you use people who have some knowledge of the companies that have stepped forward to try to filter them? Well,
the problem is nobody said that yet. The answer from government has been, well, all of the normal rules were followed. And I think you have to combine the fact that we've been in the situation of the emergency procurement and the uncompetitive award of contracts for many months now. We are still awaiting a much clearer signal from government as to when this is actually going to stop. We need to understand more clearly why that high priority lane was established. We need to understand who was told about it and when, and what the added value of it was supposed to be. But again, the statistics speak for themselves. Contracts that went through that high priority lane were 10 times more likely to be successful in securing a contract than all of the others. Now, so you take away all of the other protections around conflict of interest management, you take away all of the other protections in emergency procurement. And we understand, yes, you've got to shift stuff at speed. This is an unprecedented crisis in modern memory. So what you want to then be assured of is that you have the other checks and balances in place to ensure that we can ascertain that decisions were made only in the public interest, so that we can ascertain that taxpayers were delivered value for money. But what you also then see is a dreadful trail of poor paperwork, lack of clarity around why certain decisions were taken when, and only 25% of contracts retrospectively published by the government within the target deadline. So it's not just that there's this high priority lane, it's not just that we're in this prolonged period of emergency procurement, but all of the other checks that should be there to compensate for the lack of open tendering have also been eroded through this crisis, again, with no real clear signal of when we're going to get that back.
Okay. Jakob, let me just come back to you for a second. I think we might lose you quite soon to something else. So before that happens, if you had been in government or in a health service in this situation, would you have torn up the normal procurement rules and done what the UK government did?
No, I wouldn't. And I think I was sitting, when I listened to this, I think I also reflected back that after the initial hectic month, we continued to go about our business in the company, developing, the long-term strategy. We had to, obviously also lay off some people because we were realizing we lived in a different world. We had to negotiate and bid for new contracts. So we entered into innovation partnerships. We did our engagement survey. We've done tons of stuff. And why do I mention that? Because after the initial phase, we got used to the situation and life moved on. And I think we told ourselves, yeah, this may be a different situation, but it's not extraordinary. And I think, no, I wouldn't have torn up anything, because I think you need to fall back on your usual way of doing stuff. And you need to also force yourself to respect the normal rules. And we actually had a sort of an articulate discussion about that in the company. Let's not continue to say we're in an extraordinary situation that calls for extraordinary measures, because it is sort of an excuse for giving yourself leeway to deviate from normal good standards, good decision and quality. So no, I wouldn't have torn up anything. I think, and I would actually have tried to normalize the situation rather than using this as an excuse, because yes, it's a different world, but hey, listen, it's been more than 6 months. There's plenty of time to do, really sound, well thought through decisions. So I think it's being used as an excuse.
I'm slightly surprised to hear you say that, because the situation you described at the top of the thinking was of decisions having to be taken in real time. And if you don't get this now, you're going to lose it. And so I thought you might be more sympathetic to governments and authorities that were trying to do that.
No, I am. And I would say I don't envy those who had to make decisions about and have to make decisions about where to buy vaccines. I mean, based on what clinical profiles, what evidence, you don't want to be last to get these vaccines. So I'm sympathetic, but all I'm saying is it is more, there are some decisions that are tough, but there's also a lot of what you go about doing as a government that doesn't have to be, extraordinary. I think that's basically my message. We could isolate that to be in certain parts of the business, on certain processes, but for the rest, there's time to do things properly if you have a proper command structure. But I am sympathetic. Don't get me wrong. I'm not sitting here saying it's easy peasy to run a company through a crisis, and even less so a country. I think you just have to be careful. You're not giving yourself an excuse to be a little more lenient, because it's not good for the discipline. We have challenges in Denmark with the government not observing the law. It's raised a lot of criticism, because if you can overstep the sort of foundation for democracy, what's the next thing that's going to happen? And I think it's not good for discipline or in the decision making.
And I guess we've shown with the vaccine that with the vaccines that you can follow all the normal processes and still do things extraordinarily quickly when you have to. So maybe that's a model for extraordinary things in an ordinary way. Jakob, if you have to go, thank you so much for your time. It's been a really
thank you. Thanks.
I do want to bring Chris Wallers in. I've seen in the chat that Chris runs a PPE company, has been dealing with the Cabinet Office in the last 6 months. So while we're lining Chris up, just a reminder that do chip in via the chat. Do put your hand up if you want to join in. We do want to very much to hear from you as part of the discussion. Is Chris there? Chris Wallers. All right. While we're finding Chris, let me turn to Tom Burgess. So Tom, journalist, author of Kleptopia, I think, to give it its correct title, Tom.
That's the one.
Hey, let me just. So you deal. The Kleptopia is about proper wruption. It's about governments, officials who are in it for the money. Whose motivation is that. So I wonder whether when you look at the kind of things that we're talking about now, we can put people next to each other. We can say that rules were ripped up. We can create a lot of suspicion that there was an atmosphere and a system in place that would have allowed bad practice. But do you look at it and think this is pretty small beer compared to the stuff I trade in normally?
You're right. Yes, I spend a lot of my time dealing with big corruption in London and beyond, in West Africa, in the former Soviet Union, and so on. I absolutely don't think that there's a helpful distinction to be drawn. I mean, I thought the points that Daniel and Sophie made were absolutely excellent, and I just think maybe let's look at it. If I could just offer a completely sort of new, separate perspective for a second, there's a spectrum between, when it comes to corruption, between countries that are run altruistically, let's say, by civil servants, public officials, who will sacrifice their own interest and make every decision in the public good. And then there's a spectrum that goes all the other way to a full-on kleptocracy, where corruption has become the system of power, which is, as I argue in Kleptopia, increasingly large parts of the world, with Russia as maybe the biggest engine. But as Daniel rightly noted, and this is something that's not captured in the Corruption Perceptions Index, corruption is rife in the UK. It's just exported. You go back through the big corruption scandals of recent years, BAE, Royal Dutch Shell, and so on. The UK does its corruption in other people's countries. And, I lived in one of those countries for a while, in Nigeria. And I was listening to the discussion. I was taken back to the last crisis, 2008. And I was in Alaba market, which is the biggest electronics market in the world, where you can essentially buy everything up to and probably including a fighter jet. And I remember someone explained to me that, business was bad. And I naively assumed this was because of the global financial and economic crisis. But no, the problem was that President Yar'Adua was sick and in hospital, and therefore wasn't signing up the corrupt contracts on which the entire market ran. And that's what happens. They call it there a contractocracy. Well, that's what happens when an entire economy is based on corruption and patronage. Now, I'm not suggesting that the UK has turned into a Alaba market, but it's a big mistake that we make when we assume that we are somehow immune or we're somehow different fundamentally from, let's say in this case, Nigerians. The only difference is the strength of the institutions that can be a check on the frailty that all human beings, me and you included, have to put our hands in the till if we think no one's looking, if we think we can get away with it. And once those norms about public service and about protecting against conflict of interest start to break down, as they seem to be doing as a result of this spree of cronyism through COVID contracting, then the central bricks of democracy start to be eroded, I'd say.
Okay, so you don't give any kind of weight at all to culture in that. So it's about process. It's about standards that are imposed. Without that, you think the UK.
Well, culture's part of that. I mean, norms are part of culture. what I'm talking about is culture. Our institutions are an expression of our culture.
But my point is that it's not our culture that's changed in the last 6 months, it's our processes that have changed. But I was just trying to draw out whether you think that actually that could lead to a cultural change quite quickly, or whether actually there's already a corrupt culture there.
Interesting. I mean, these two things, this is a big subject, I think, but these two things, I think, reflect each other. I had a drink the other day, back when such things were allowed, with a great old contact who'd been in MI6 for his whole career, and who had been in Russia and watched the sort of kleptification of Russia, and had also worked as an advisor for senior British politicians. And he remarked that there's been this long, slow erosion of the idea of public service, and it goes hand in hand with the kind of the introduction of market principles and the profit principles to public service. And that's a whole other debate about the merits or otherwise of introducing markets to deliver public services. But my ex-spook, his argument was that you've seen in tandem this erosion of the idea of self-sacrificing public service, this normalizing of the idea that at the end of a career in public service, if you get high up, you should automatically end up being fantastically rich like Tony Blair. That's become completely standard. And then at the same time, we see this creeping and frankly terrifying, and Open Democracy has been mentioned, and Private Eye and others have been documenting this brilliantly, and I have a crack at it in my book. This permeation of money from the big kleptocracies in the former Soviet Union and elsewhere into the very heart of British politics. Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party are infused with money, we know perfectly clearly, that comes from very rich people who got very rich in the biggest and the worst kleptocracies. So you talk about culture and processes, but they're linked, and one changes to reflect the other. So when, Daniel was talking so eloquently about how we were in a weak position in terms of things like a culture of protection against conflict of interest when COVID came, that's, I would argue, because we've been infused, if you like, by the spirit of kleptocracy for so long.
Okay. Can I bring in Hester McCreary from the chat? Because I know this is an area that interests you, Hester. Are you there? Because I think you're making, in a sense, similar points to Tom's about the link between a sort of economic ideology and where you think we are now. Hester, are you there?
Hello. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, and we can see you too. So you mentioned, I think in your last post, you mentioned, you linked this back to a sort of an ideology that you see behind the way that contracts have been let out in this pandemic. What are you thinking?
Yeah, well, and I'm sorry, because I get frustrated quite easily in conversations like this, because I don't understand why people aren't doing more action now. Where the fact I was really happy we were having the thinking, is COVID a cover-up for corruption? Because clearly it is, because clearly the world is corrupt. That's kind of the way history's gone. We could trace it back through our system, the system before that, lots of things. And I don't know, I'm sorry, it's a big one, but we do appear to be in, an epochal shift, if you want to call it that, digitalization, a massive global look at the world. And I don't understand why I think, so to argue, like, everybody knows it's corrupt. Most things are corrupt. Capitalism inherently corrupt, really, this system we're in, and that was only a fix to get us out of the scrapes of the 20th century, really. So yes, for me, my question is kind of, or the topic I'd like people to be talking about is, what do we do about having established this? We could be here like a long time talking about how corrupt, and finding more evidences and more sources and more data and more metrics to say it is. Knowing that in the position we are, whilst there's a relatively scary pandemic out there on the loose, is just really, how do we fix like the mentality that people have been on? Because I don't think any sort of, like, if you want to use the term career politician, like lots of the Tory parties, the MPs, they've grown up with these ideas, and then they've also profited by them. And it's very hard to change a belief system. It is very hard to change a belief system when you've been brought up that way. But these are, yeah, that's what I mean when changing our ideology.
That's really useful. I think we'll come back to those things, but before we do, I've been trying to go to Chris Waters for a little while. I think, Chris, I'm told that you're there now. So what I was told before was that you have been dealing, you've been dealing with the Cabinet Office over PPE contracts for 6 months or so. So perhaps you could just sort of tell us what your experience has been.
Yeah, sure. So apologies for the delay there. Yeah, so we're a glove supplier. We're on the supply chain glove framework. So we've been supplying gloves to the NHS via supply chain for coming up to 5 years, I suppose. And so over the last 6 months, I guess, starting around March time, we were aware that the Cabinet Office had set up a sort of separate buying office from supply chain. And what we were told, and what makes sense, is that supply chain had sort of run out of options with current suppliers, including ourselves. We've been approached by supply chain to supply more product than usual. And unfortunately, due to the nature of the product, you can't just massively increase supply over the short term. It's just not possible. So our understanding was that the Cabinet Office Department had set up a sort of a procurement team that covered various products, including gloves, and they were setting out to source these products from non-standard suppliers, if you like, so anybody who wasn't on the normal frameworks. And in our experience, I suppose the challenge there was that they were often competing amongst each other for the same products from the same suppliers. And we've sort of assisted where we could with some of the review of some of those suppliers. And I think it's fair to say that although they've got checks on who those suppliers are, their checks are probably not quite as robust as they could always have been. Yeah. But I think one of the important bits was that sort of internal bidding, where you had different procurement teams within the same government departments all sort of bidding for the same supplier's business, if you like.
Yeah, but actually, Chris, it's a really good example, isn't it? Because so a new process was invented to circumvent the process that you've been part of for some time with your company.
Yep.
So it's the kind of situation where people will look in and think, well, why has this been done? Is that eccentric? Is it potentially corrupt? What's going on here? As a decision, did it make sense to you that that's what the government did, or did it look like a poor decision or a wrong decision?
No, I think from our perspective, for our sort of niche product in our industry, it made sense. If you've approached your 4 or 5 key suppliers for those products and none of them can help, where else would you turn? You have to open the doors to other people. I suppose the question is, are you doing that as effectively as you could? Should you still retain some of those normal checks and balances around tender processes? With awarding contracts without any form of competition, you would think would be a mistake. But it seems like that's what happened. That was out of desperation, I suppose, that they couldn't source products from the usual routes. They've had to go wider than that. That's, I guess, understandable in the situation now. I'm only talking about one specific product in a particular area, but that sort of principle at least makes sense to me.
And can you tell me if your company's been awarded any contracts without competition through this pandemic?
No, we haven't. No.
We haven't. And in your view, just to go back to what Jakob was talking about earlier, does the suspension of those normal procurement processes make sense to you in the circumstances, or do you think it would have been possible to speed them up?
I would have thought that they could have at least retained some element of competition. I mean, I guess that the lack of competition is one thing, that this sort of reliance on middlemen, if you like. It's not hard in our industry to find who the original equipment manufacturers are of these products. To find the top 30 glove companies in the world is not a challenge. To run some kind of procurement process directly with those companies, you wouldn't think would be too difficult. Yeah.
No, it's possible, isn't it, that the role of middlemen will be one of the interesting things that comes out of this. All right, I'm going to thanks so much for doing that.
No
problem. I'm going to come to my colleague Chris Cook, who's been looking into this area for tortoise and sent me a slightly alarming message a few minutes ago saying, I have thoughts, which, if you know Chris, is not a great surprise. But Chris, if you're there, what are your thoughts?
No. So I think it's worth going back, if you like, to the time before crisis, to think about what the British state was good at and bad at in normal times. Because actually it is as Tom and other people have, and Hester reflected, we are a state that does a lot of procuring, like an unusual amount. We outsource a lot, but actually the relationship we're very bad at contracting out though, right? So we've gotten to this very unhappy dance with a small number of large companies where we continuously squeeze down their profit margins. They continually chisel out ways of trying to basically reduce service so that they can make a profit. And the result is that they are unhappy because fundamentally they don't make very much money, and we're unhappy because we get a terrible service. At the same time, the government is also actually very bad at enforcing contractual provisions, right? It's a very weak contractor. It's very common that if you have a contract that goes awry, so a supplier doesn't deliver in the public service, what happens is it's embarrassing for the department that the contract didn't work in some sense, so we don't pursue them. So actually, we're kind of the British state is kind of a patsy, right? It does a lot of procuring, but actually, for the most part, if you shave off the edges of the contract, you'll get away with it. And during a crisis, the lack of capability has exploded. I think my sort of working theory at the moment of how how you should think about the crisis at the moment and the disastrous procurement processes is that it is it's very naive. There's a lot of things where they assume everyone is public spirited and kindly. And even the VIP lane, my assumption is what this is about is someone has come in and said, well, I know this company's really good, and it'd be really good if we could find a way to make sure that these public spirited people who want to help get seen and they're not just lost in the melee. We're not realizing that creates a crack in the system that allows, weaknesses to grow. So I think that's it's an incompetent state which permits private sector corruption, I think, is the problem we're going to run into. I don't think there's a civil servant who's going to get rich out of this, or not many anyway. I don't think there's a politician who's going to get very rich out of this. Not many anyway. It's about a weak process that allows the state to be taken advantage of.
Yeah, but then it's interesting, isn't it, Chris, which of those weak processes we care about? Because I was looking at some figures that came out a week or two back from the British Business Bank. They looked at the bounce back loan scheme, which, as you will know, is the kind of smaller of the government loan schemes that lend to businesses in trouble. And by the end of October, the British Business Bank had found 27,000 fraudulent applications for bounce back loans with a value, if they'd gone through, of £1.1 billion. And I suspect that those are likely to be a minority of the fraudulent applications that were made, that much more than £1.1 billion would have been sucked out of that scheme by who knows who. We are obsessed with a bloke in Florida who gets 21 million quid. There's been so little coverage of the 1.1, of the huge leakage from the government loan schemes to business. And sorry, the reason I'm going off on this is because I wonder how much of this you think is to do with a tendency these days to paint political opponents as inherently corrupt and malign. That's a pattern you see around the world, whilst we're busily turning a blind eye to where the real money is leaking out of the system.
I think that's part of the problem is about process and about the appearance of process with this stuff. So the thing that links all this stuff together is that the reason why we like having middlemen in this stuff is we like usually a guy who can turn up, fill in the form, be a British resident who we can sort of pursue. And we don't want to directly contract with a Chinese factory. And similarly, even though we are willing to pay it turns out, a massive premium for not having to have civil servants go to a Chinese company and directly contract in Shanghai. That's part of the revealed preference of the British state. And similarly, the Treasury fund, the way the government often thinks is, if there is a process in place, then whatever happens cannot be corruption if it follows the process. So you'll sometimes say, so like I did a story years ago about where the Department for Education accidentally overpaid hundreds of schools by literally millions of pounds a year. And they kept coming back and saying, we haven't overpaid them. That's the amount we were supposed to pay them. And you can tell that because, well, that's the amount we paid them. That's the amount that so how can it not be the amount we're supposed to pay them? And there's a lot of this sort of processology that goes into lots of this stuff. It's that the appearance of process is what they confuse for rigor and probity.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to come back to Daniel Bruce. I can see in the chat that I think Nicholas Stanhope is a bit unsympathetic to my digression into that sort of political culture question. But Daniel, let me just turn back to you, because how much of if everybody is shouting corruption just because they don't like a political opponent, is that a problem for an organisation like Transparency International?
You know, we've been around for 25 years, and one of the most difficult tasks we've had in that time is to define corruption. After a lot of time, we settled on a movement-wide definition of the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain, and that can be political or financial gain. And I think in the context of the conversation we're having tonight, it's that word abuse, which is really important when it comes to us understanding what has or has not happened throughout the UK government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. We feel it's very important that when there is presumably what we hope will be a full independent public inquiry into the government's handling of the pandemic, that the integrity of the public procurement process is an explicit part of the terms of reference of that inquiry. Because if there was that abuse, if there was what we would recognise, and I know others here tonight will have a different view of what corruption should be defined as, but if it was that abuse, firstly, was it really there? Was there purposeful abuse? If it was there, why was it there? And how did it end up being there in the first place? Or if it wasn't abuse, how much of what we have seen is just accidental or habit or ease? I know that if I have an emergency or a crisis, I will look to those that I know and trust for help, for information, for assistance. And we know that political culture does the same, and that politicians often rely on these close social networks around them. So again, the ground for some of the decisions that we've seen taken was very fertile. So if a public inquiry, hypothetically, were to find that actually there wasn't any corruption with a capital C in the way that we might define it as purposeful abuse of the system, but if there was a catalogue of decisions that led to, for example, public money not always being spent in the public interest, or extreme profiteering on the parts of middle people and so on and so forth, then again, we have to look at why the system allowed that to happen in the first place. Why do we have a parliamentary standards commissioner that doesn't have enough teeth? Why do we have a conflict of interest system that thinks that it's okay to declare a conflict, but then still not manage that conflict of interest? These are some of the sort of foundational problems that we have in how we address these risks. And I think we will need to see change. We needed that change before the pandemic, but what is more concerning now is how do we get back to where we were, and when are we going to get some reassurance on that in order to advance some of those changes?
Now, as you see, I'm in the office and all the lights have gone off because I'm the only one here. So in a second, I'm going to have to get up and wander around to get them to come back on again, which I'll do. But while I'm about to do that, I'm going to come to Sophie Hill and then to my colleague James Harding, I've been managed to miss his hand in the chat. Sophie, can I just come back to you, because a lot of people are asking in the chat, what can we do about this? And I just want to ask you how useful you think the thing that you're doing is, because you call My Little Crony a map. But I wonder if you think it's how useful you're finding it, just to put things next to each other and allow people to infer patterns rather than really saying there is something going on here.
Yeah, I think a better way to describe it would be a work in progress, because this is based on what we know. And a consistent theme throughout this crisis has been that the government has been very slow to publish even basic details about contracts. And the National Audit Office report, I think, was pretty scathing about the government's ability to simply publish the fact that it had awarded a contract within, 3 months. That's a pretty poor performance. I think in one sense, the goal of the map is to help people put these stories in context. And the conclusion that I draw from that is that we need a public inquiry, and one that is fairly broad in scope, because As your wonderful slides documented, there are thousands of contracts that have been awarded. And there are some fantastic investigative journalists who are pouring through them manually and sort of trying to make these connections. But that's something that needs to be done systematically. And it's going to be up to the government whether they'd rather face the drip, drip, drip of stories one by one, or whether they're prepared to actually defend their process. If they did act with the best intentions and they did do the best they could, they should be prepared to kind of give a robust defense.
Great. Okay, let me, James Harding, are you out there still? I've been ignoring you.
Kerry, I'm really enjoying this. I was particularly thinking of that Washington Post logo, "Democracy dies in darkness," but not Thinkins. They just keep on plowing on. And there's quite a lot of chat. I don't know whether you saw that Andrew Girdwood gave you a 9 out of 10 for spin, which I thought was generous. I thought anyway. We'll come back to that in a minute. I saw that Yelena wants to say something, so I'm just going to say very briefly. I think that I just wanted to point out that that everyone says, if you like, in journalism, the really courageous moment is when you say roll the presses, run the story. Often the more difficult moments when you say stop the presses, we don't have the story. And I just wanted to say I really appreciated sort of Daniel Bruce's efforts to try and get some grip on what is the cozy appointments process without due process, what is the abuse that involves personal enrichment, or to Chris's point, a failure to respect the coffers of the state. I suppose I disagreed with Tom Burgess about the elision of one thing into another. I think it's really important to see the differences, because they are different kinds of quote unquote abuse or laziness. And in this particular crisis, this is a very kind of uncool point to make. They're also people who've weighed in because they thought they could be helpful, they could have acts of public service, and then find themselves on the end of a criticism that they were too close, or they were using beneficial access. I make the point that I think, Chris's point about how you reach for people in a crisis is true, and this happens, I think, to every organisation. It's happened in government too. So I just think the difficulty in telling this story is you've got to zero in on the things that are either systemic or egregious. And that's the reason why I messaged you, just to say your point about the bounce back loans is exactly right. That's a systemic failure to identify, what's in effect criminal action at a huge cost, right? It's just not as kind of storied as some of the stories we've looked at so far.
Yeah, okay. Let me just come back to Tom Burgess. We're running out of time, but Tom, just a final word from you. When James, as you heard, is unsure about this spectrum, or unsure whether you can elide the spectrum in the way that you suggested we could. Why do you think it is possible to make that elision?
Yeah, look, so we're talking here, I think, aren't we, about the elision, but from what? From the market with those electronic goods, the sort of really corrupt world that you look at in your books and your reporting. Yeah,
and the kind of we're talking about the elision between smoke and fire, I suppose, in a certain sense.
I think it's for me, it's just self-evident. What other condition could there be that fundamentally separates a British person from a Nigerian person? There isn't one. All we're talking about in different political systems is the extent to which economic and political power can be kept separate from one another. That's the difference between a kleptocracy and a democracy. And that's the reason why so many post-imperial states are corrupt, because political and economic power were deliberately fused together. And that was the model that they inherited in independence. Now, there's a handful of states, the UK included, that have a long and extraordinary tradition of keeping economic and political power separate. And it's when those two things start to get eroded that those norms start to break down. Now, it could be that the way COVID contracting was done was both absolutely necessary and terribly damaging because of what it did to those norms.
Okay. I just want to, even though I'm trying people's patience by running over time here, let me just finally come to Yelena Sofronievich, who has been desperately trying to get in for a little while. So Yelena, thanks for your patience.
No.
You particularly wanted to come back on something that James said.
Yeah, I just really quickly wanted to bring it up. I thought, Kerry, what you mentioned and Tom earlier about public and political culture and turning a blind eye, I'd actually contest that COVID is not necessarily being used as cover for corruption, but rather that corruption is being used as cover for COVID by the government. I don't think that the media and political rhetoric of chumocracy is necessarily especially constructive in tackling these abuses or, you know, ensuring that public money is being spent in the public interest, because I think we're focusing more on things like drawing a ring around Preeti Patel than we are about ring fencing NHS funding. And I think, you know, Sophie was talking about the importance of encouraging people to make their own judgments, to research into this, and you're running the COVID inquiry. Daniel Bruce was talking about that as well. And actually, I think the government is using the rhetoric of chumocracy to sort of mitigate public expectations about its ultimately very poor performance. And the bit I mentioned about James earlier is something that Andrew put in the chat. He said, I wish I could be more surprised. And I think that this rhetoric is actually, you know, as journalists and as politicians, we have a responsibility to try and stimulate public interest and public participation. And I think that actually the way that it's been framed in the media is not doing that. And it's allowing the government to systematically use it as a means to cover its own back.
Okay, Yelena, thank you so much. And that will be our last word for tonight. Let me thank Jakob, who's no longer on the call. I was going to say no longer with us, but I mean on the call. Let me thank Tom Burgess and Sophie Hill and Daniel Bruce. I think if we are trying to think of what we as Tortoise will pull out of this discussion, there's a lot. I would say, firstly, and sort of self-evidently, is COVID cover for corruption? I mean, in a certain sense, yes, of course, because pandemics always are. These moments of disruption always will be. We've got this fascinating question about whether the latency of corruption, I suppose, that Tom Burgess took us into, are our processes all that separate us from sliding down that league table that Daniel Bruce and Transparency International showed us before, or is there something cultural that is a kind of check on that? Does it, you know, is it the same sort of culture that, as James Harding was saying, encourages people to chip in and help out? Chris Cook has made the point throughout this pandemic that one of the features of the British state is a sort of, it is chumming. The nature of the way that power is distributed in this country tends towards that. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's corrupt. So it takes you back to James's point about whether we roll the presses on this or not. It's certainly, I think, far too early to roll the presses on corruption. I don't think anybody, particularly on the call, would say that at the moment. But I come back to this thing that I don't think I'm quite alone in being really interested in, which is how much, you know, when you look at the sort of deals and the sort of cronyism, the sort of corruption that we have been really interested in this country through the last several months. And those, like the bounce back loans, where we've been, I would say, spectacularly uninterested. What's the difference between those two things? Is it that actually there is a political motivation there's a caricature of the Conservatives, which is that they will get out of their beds every morning and figure out how to feather the nests of the people closest to them. Is that playing a part in the debate at the moment? And if that's true, is that a helpful thing? That's plenty from me. The inquiry, the Tortoise COVID inquiry, continues again this Friday. So do join us for that. I think it kicks off at 10 o'clock. But for now, for everyone on the call, thank you very much, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you.